March 12, 1947. The back room of Rao's restaurant in East Harlem. 11 men sat around a table covered in wine bottles, playing cards, and enough cash to buy 3 city blocks. Vincent the Chin Gigani was 19 years old, barely more than muscle at this point in his career, standing guard by the door. Frank Costello sat at the head of the table, orchestrating the meeting with his usual diplomatic precision. And across from him sat a man who would be dead before sunrise. His name was Sal Maranzano, Jr., son of the legendary mob boss who died in 1931, trying to rebuild his father's reputation through arrogance and volume. He was 34 years old, loud, and convinced that being Italian made him automatically superior to every other criminal in New York City. "Bumpy Johnson," Sal said, his voice thick with wine and contempt. "You're telling me we're supposed to treat some Harlem street thug like an equal?" The room went quiet. Frank Costello's face remained neutral, but his hands stopped moving. That was never a good sign. Sal didn't notice, or didn't care. He was on a roll now, playing to the younger guys at the table, men who hadn't lived through the territory wars of the 1930s, who didn't understand how carefully the current peace had been constructed. My father would have laughed at this. A black gangster sitting at the same table as real men, getting the same cut as a made guy. Sal laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Bumpy Johnson is a joke, and if nobody else has the balls to say it, I will." 3 of the younger men laughed with him. The older ones, Costello, Anthony Fat Tony Salerno, and Tommy Lucchese, exchanged glances that said everything without words. Costello finally spoke. "Sal, you should stop talking now." "Why? Because you're afraid of some Harlem pimp?" "Let me tell you something, Frank." "You're not telling me anything," Costello interrupted, his voice still calm, but now edged with something colder. "You're embarrassing yourself. And worse, you're embarrassing me." Sal's face flushed red. "You've gone soft. All of you. My father built this thing with strength, and you've turned it into a tea party with." He didn't finish the sentence because the door opened. Bumpy Johnson walked in. He was 42 years old, dressed in an immaculate suit, his expression unreadable. Behind him stood 2 men, Junie Bird and Illinois Gordon, both veterans of Bumpy's organization, both perfectly calm. The room transformed. The laughter died. The younger guys suddenly found their cards very interesting. Even Sal Maranzano, Jr., with all his bravado, seemed to shrink slightly in his chair. Bumpy looked around the room slowly, his eyes passing over each face. When he reached Sal, he stopped. "I heard my name," Bumpy said quietly. "Thought I'd come see what the conversation was about." What happened in the next 12 hours would become one of the most carefully orchestrated displays of power in organized crime history. Not a single shot would be fired. Not a single punch would be thrown. But by morning, everyone in New York's underworld would understand exactly what happened when you mocked Bumpy Johnson's authority. The question wasn't whether Sal would survive the night. The question was whether he'd wish he hadn't. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand how fragile the peace was in 1947. New York's organized crime structure was barely 16 years old, dating back to the 1931 Castellammarese War that ended with the creation of the Commission. The system was revolutionary. 5 Italian families cooperating instead of competing, dividing territory and business rationally instead of fighting bloody wars every few years. But the system had a problem. It only worked if everyone respected it. By 1947, the Luciano family, now effectively run by Frank Costello after Lucky Luciano's deportation in 1946, controlled significant portions of Manhattan's gambling, loan sharking, and labor rackets. The Harlem Numbers operation alone generated an estimated $30 million annually, equivalent to roughly $400 million today. And 40% of that money flowed through operations controlled or partnered with Bumpy Johnson. This wasn't tokenism. This wasn't the mob being generous. This was hard mathematics. Bumpy controlled the street-level infrastructure that made the numbers game work. The runners, the collectors, the local protection, the community trust that kept people playing and paying. When Lucky Luciano made his original deal with Bumpy in 1935, it was purely pragmatic. Dutch Schultz had tried to take Harlem by force and created chaos. Bumpy offered stability, local knowledge, and a sustainable business model. The fact that he was black was irrelevant to the bottom line. But to men like Sal Maranzano Jr., it was everything. Sal represented a dying ideology in the mob, the old-school belief that Italian heritage alone granted authority. His father, Salvatore Maranzano Sr., had literally called himself boss of bosses before being killed in 1931 by the very modernization movement that created the commission. The younger Maranzano inherited his father's arrogance, but none of his strategic intelligence. He'd spent the 1940s trying to build a crew, but he kept making enemies through sheer abrasiveness. By March 1947, he was running a small gambling operation in the Bronx and borrowing money from more successful gangsters, a humiliating position for someone who thought his last name meant something. That's why he was at Rouse that night. He owed Frank Costello $15,000 and was trying to negotiate an extension. Instead of being humble, he'd chosen to be loud. Instead of showing respect to the system that was giving him a chance, he'd mocked it. And specifically, he mocked Bumpy Johnson, the one partner Costello absolutely could not afford to lose. Because here's what Sal didn't understand. Bumpy wasn't just a business partner. He was a proof of concept. He demonstrated that the commission's approach, merit-based organization, rational profit sharing, respect for capability over ethnicity, actually worked. If Bumpy could be insulted without consequence, the entire structure became questionable. Other non-Italian partners would wonder if they were respected or merely tolerated, and that doubt would fracture the delicate alliances that kept New York's underworld from descending into constant warfare. Frank Costello understood this perfectly. That's why, when Bumpy walked into Rouse that night, Costello didn't try to smooth things over or minimize what Sal had said. Instead, he stood up, gestured to his own chair, and offered it to Bumpy. Bumpy sat down in Frank Costello's chair, the head of the table. It was a deliberate, powerful gesture. In mob protocol, that seat meant authority. Costello had just publicly acknowledged that in this moment, in this conflict, Bumpy held the higher position. Sal's face went from red to pale. He finally understood he'd made a catastrophic mistake. "Sal," Bumpy said, his voice conversational, almost friendly. "Frank tells me you have concerns about our business arrangement." "I didn't mean," Sal started. "You said I was a joke," Bumpy interrupted gently. "You said I was a street thug. You questioned whether I deserved respect from real men." He paused. "Did I get that right?" The room was absolutely silent. Even the kitchen noise from beyond the door seemed to have stopped. Sal looked at Costello, but Costello's expression was unreadable. No help was coming from that direction. "I was just talking," Sal said weakly, blowing off steam. "Interesting," Bumpy said, "because here's what I think. I think you believe what you said. I think you've been saying it to other people. And I think you're not the only one who feels this way." He was right. In the 2 years since Lucky Luciano's deportation, there had been growing tension among younger mob members who resented non-Italian partners. They saw the old restrictions lifting and didn't like it. Sal was just the loudest voice of a quiet movement. "So here's what we're going to do," Bumpy continued. "You're going to spend the rest of this night learning exactly what my organization does, how many people it employs, how much money it generates, how many communities depend on it. And then, tomorrow morning, you're going to explain to this entire table whether I'm still a joke." Sal blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean you're coming with me. Right now. You're going to see Harlem. Not as a tourist. Not as a tough guy. As a student." Fat Tony Salerno, who'd been quiet until now, spoke up. "Bumpy, is this necessary?" "Extremely," Bumpy said, not looking away from Sal. "Because if he doesn't understand what he's mocking, how can he learn respect?" It was brilliant. Bumpy wasn't asking permission to retaliate. He was offering education. He was framing this as mentorship rather than punishment. But everyone in that room understood the subtext. Sal Maranzano Jr. was about to spend the night under Bumpy Johnson's control, in Bumpy's territory, completely at Bumpy's mercy. If Sal refused, he'd look weak. If he accepted, he'd be admitting that Bumpy had authority over him. Either way, he'd already lost. "All right," Sal said finally, trying to salvage some dignity. "Show me Harlem. Let's see if it's as impressive as you think." Bumpy stood. "Frank, we'll be back by sunrise. Continue your meeting." Costello nodded. "Sal, listen more than you talk tonight. You might learn something." Bumpy walked toward the door. Sal stood up, straightened his jacket, and followed. Junie and Illinois fell in behind them. As they left, Tommy Lucchese muttered to Costello, "That kid's not coming back the same." "No," Costello agreed. "He's not." 11:47 p.m. Bumpy's car, a dark blue Cadillac, pulled onto 125th Street. Sal sat in the back seat next to Bumpy, trying to look unimpressed. But his eyes kept darting to the streets, taking in the crowds, the energy, the sheer density of life still vibrant at midnight. "First stop," Bumpy said. They pulled up to the Teresa Hotel, the most prestigious black hotel in America, where everyone from Joe Louis to Lena Horne stayed when they visited New York. The lobby was elegant, bustling, filled with well-dressed people conducting business at midnight like it was noon. Bumpy walked in. The desk clerk's face lit up. "Mr. Johnson, good evening." "Evening, Marcus. This is Sal. He's learning about business operations. Mind showing him your ledgers?" Marcus didn't hesitate. He pulled out a massive book, opened it to show columns of numbers, reservations, payments, expenses, profits, all meticulously recorded. "We have 300 rooms," Marcus explained to Sal. "Average occupancy is 87%. We employ 64 people full-time, and we pay a fair percentage to Mr. Johnson's organization for protection and service coordination." "How much?" Sal asked. 8% of gross profits," Marcus said. "Fair market rate. In exchange, we never have labor problems, never have supply issues, and never get harassed by police raids." They spent 20 minutes going through the books. Sal stayed quiet, but he was calculating. 8% of a 300-room hotel's profits every month, just from this one location. "Next stop," Bumpy said. Over the next 4 hours, they visited a numbers bank on 147th Street, where 12 people worked through the night processing bets, paying winners, recording losses. The operation handled over $50,000 in daily volume. Bumpy's cut 15% of profits. 3 speakeasies, still operating despite prohibition ending in 1933, because they served after legal hours and provided entertainment that legitimate establishments couldn't. Combined monthly revenue, $180,000. Bumpy's percentage, 10% for protection and supply coordination. A loan operation that provided capital to black-owned businesses at fair interest rates. Nothing like the predatory loan sharking the Italian families ran downtown, but sustainable business lending at 8 to 10% interest. Total loans outstanding, $2.3 million. A taxi dispatch service that employed 47 drivers, serving Harlem exclusively because white cab companies refused to pick up black passengers. Revenue, $30,000 monthly. At each location, Bumpy introduced Sal to the managers, the workers, the people who made the machine function. And at each location, the response was the same. Genuine respect, sometimes even affection, for Bumpy Johnson. Not fear. Respect. By 3 a.m., Sal was starting to look exhausted. They stopped at Wells Restaurant, the same place where Bumpy would die 21 years later for coffee and food. "You starting to understand?" Bumpy asked. Sal was quiet for a long moment. "You're not just a gangster." "No," Bumpy agreed. "I'm a businessman. And more than that, I'm an infrastructure provider. In a neighborhood that the city abandoned, that banks won't serve, that legitimate businesses ignore, I provide services. Jobs, capital, protection, order." "You're still a criminal," Sal said, but there was less conviction in his voice now. "Sure," Bumpy said, "but so are you. The difference is, I'm a criminal who builds things. You're a criminal who destroys them. If you're watching this and you want to understand how real power operated in 20th century America, not through violence, but through economics, psychology, and strategic thinking, make sure you're subscribed. These stories don't get taught in schools, but they shape the country we live in today. 4:15 a.m. They were sitting in Bumpy's car, parked on a quiet corner of St. Nicholas Avenue. You know why your father failed? Bumpy asked suddenly. Sal's head snapped up. What? Salvatore Maranzano. You know why he died? He was betrayed. He was stupid, Bumpy said flatly. He declared himself boss of bosses in a system that was specifically designed to prevent any one person from having that much power. He thought a title meant something. He thought respect could be demanded instead of earned. Sal's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. You're making the same mistake, Bumpy continued. You think being Italian makes you special. You think your last name entitles you to respect. But respect isn't inherited. It's built. Every single day, through competence, through fairness, through proving that you're worth the space you take up. And you've proven that? Sal asked, defensive. Ask anyone we met tonight, Bumpy said simply. Ask them if I've earned my position. Then ask yourself what you've earned. It was brutal, but it was also true. Sal Maranzano Jr. had inherited a famous name and turned it into nothing. He was $15,000 in debt to Frank Costello. He ran a failing operation in the Bronx. He had no meaningful crew, no significant territory, no achievements beyond surviving his father's legacy. And tonight, he'd try to compensate for all of that inadequacy by mocking someone who had actually built something. You want to know the real difference between us? Bumpy asked. It's not race. It's not even competence. It's purpose. I built this because my community needed it. You're trying to build something because you need it, and people can tell the difference. The sun was starting to rise. The streets of Harlem were beginning to wake up, delivery trucks, early workers, the city transforming from night to day. One more stop, Bumpy said. They drove to a small apartment building on 139th Street. Bumpy led Sal upstairs to a third-floor apartment. He knocked. An older woman answered, maybe 70 years old, wearing a housecoat, her eyes still heavy with sleep. Mr. Johnson, she said, surprised. Is everything all right? Yes, Mrs. Williams. Sorry to wake you. I wanted to show my friend something. She looked confused, but stepped aside. They entered a modest apartment, clean, well-maintained, but clearly the home of someone living on limited means. Mrs. Williams, Bumpy said, would you tell my friend here what you do for a living? I'm a seamstress, she said. Retired now, mostly. I've taken a few jobs here and there. And your son? Her face changed, pride mixed with old grief. David died in 1944. Battle of the Bulge. He was 23. I'm sorry, Sal said automatically. After David died, Bumpy continued. Mrs. Williams had trouble making rent. The city was going to evict her. You remember what happened? Mrs. Williams smiled. Mr. Johnson helped me. Covered 3 months' rent while I found work. And when I tried to pay him back, he refused. She tried to pay me back for 6 years, Bumpy said. I never took a dollar. You know why, Sal? Sal shook his head. Because David Williams was one of my runners before he enlisted. Worked for me for 2 years, saved his money, helped his mother. When he went to war, he asked me to look after her if anything happened. So I did. That's what respect means. That's what power is actually for. They left Mrs. Williams's apartment. As they walked back to the car, Sal was completely quiet. 6:42 a.m. They walked back into Rao's restaurant. The meeting had continued through the night. Frank Costello, Fat Tony, Tommy Lucchese, and the others were still there, though the card game had ended and they were now just drinking coffee and talking business. They all looked up when Bumpy and Sal entered. Sal, Costello said, you have something to say? Sal Maranzano Jr. stood in front of the table. He looked exhausted, humbled, fundamentally changed from the loud, arrogant man who'd been there 8 hours earlier. I was wrong, he said simply. About Mr. Johnson. About Harlem. About everything I said. Why were you wrong? Costello pressed. Because I was measuring power by the wrong metrics. I thought it was about heritage, about history, about being Italian. But power is about what you build, what you protect, what you provide. He paused. Mr. Johnson has built more than I ever will, and he deserves every bit of respect he receives. Bumpy didn't gloat. He didn't even smile. He just nodded once. Apology accepted, Bumpy said. Now, about your debt to Frank. I'll pay it, Sal interrupted. Full amount. By the end of the month. Ow, Fat Tony asked. Last I heard, your operation was barely breaking even. Then I'll work for someone who knows what they're doing, Sal said. He looked at Bumpy. If you'll have me. The room went completely silent. It was an extraordinary moment. A Italian mobster, the son of a former boss of bosses, asking a black gangster from Harlem for a job. Bumpy studied Sal for a long moment. You understand what you're asking? Yes. You understand that in my organization, your last name means nothing? That you'd start at the bottom like everyone else? Yes. And you understand that this means working with people you previously thought you were better than? I understand, Sal said quietly. And I was wrong about that, too. Bumpy looked at Frank Costello. Costello gave the slightest nod. This is your call. All right, Bumpy said finally. You work for Illinois Gordon for 6 months. He runs my Bronx operations. You do exactly what he tells you, when he tells you, without question. If he says you're worth keeping after 6 months, we'll talk about a permanent position. Thank you, Sal said. Don't thank me yet, Bumpy replied. Illinois is harder to impress than I am. Sal Maranzano Jr. worked for Bumpy Johnson's organization for 3 years, from 1947 to 1950. He started as a collector, the lowest position in the numbers operation, knocking on doors, gathering bets, recording transactions. According to reports, he was competent but never exceptional. He learned humility the hard way, through daily subordination to people he'd previously considered beneath him. In 1950, he left Bumpy's organization to start a legitimate trucking business in Queens. He was moderately successful, never wealthy, but stable. He died in 1979 at age 66, largely forgotten by mob historians. But the story of that night, March 12, 1947, became legendary in New York's underworld. Not because of violence, but because of what it represented. Frank Costello later told an associate that Bumpy's handling of the Sal situation was the smartest piece of business I ever witnessed. Instead of killing Sal, which would have required commission approval and created political complications, Bumpy had transformed him. He'd taken a critic and turned him into proof that the system worked. More importantly, he'd sent a message to every other young mobster who questioned whether non-Italian partners deserved respect. Mock Bumpy Johnson, and you don't get killed. You get educated. And education is far more humiliating than death. The incident reinforced Bumpy's position not just in Harlem, but in the broader commission structure. It demonstrated sophistication, restraint, and strategic thinking, exactly the qualities that made him valuable to the Italian families. It also revealed something deeper about Bumpy's worldview. He could have had Sal killed. He could have demanded financial compensation. He could have used the insult as justification for violence. Instead, he chose to teach, to demonstrate his power not through destruction, but through construction, to prove that his organization was legitimate, professional, and worthy of respect, not because of threats, but because of results. This wasn't just gangster politics. It was leadership. In 1963, when Bumpy returned from his Alcatraz sentence, New York had changed dramatically. The old commission structure was fracturing. New players were emerging. The civil rights movement was transforming American society, and with it, the possibilities for black economic and political power. But the principles Bumpy had demonstrated that night in 1947 remained relevant. Respect must be earned. Power must be demonstrated. And the strongest response to mockery isn't violence. It's proof. When Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, His funeral was attended by over 3,000 people. Italian mobsters sent flowers. Harlem residents lined the streets. Politicians who'd publicly condemned him privately acknowledged his importance to the community. Sal Maranzano Jr. didn't attend, but according to one account, he sent a simple card with 3 words, "You were right." The laughter that started that night at Rao's restaurant died before sunrise, and it was replaced by something far more valuable: understanding. That's the real story. Not that Bumpy Johnson destroyed a man who mocked him, but that he transformed him. Not that he proved his power through violence, but that he proved it through competence, patience, and a willingness to educate rather than eliminate. Sal Maranzano Jr. walked into Rao's thinking Italian heritage made him superior. He walked out understanding that merit, capability, and purpose were the only measurements that mattered. And Bumpy Johnson, the man he called a joke, taught him that lesson without throwing a single punch. That's power, real power, the kind that doesn't fade when the sun rises, the kind that builds instead of destroys, the kind that lasts.